Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes, where we take a deep dive into Magnetic Mountain, Stalinism as a Civilization by Stephen Kotkin. This isn't just a straightforward history book. It's a really profound look at how the Soviet Union, under Stalin, attempted to build an entirely new kind of society. I mean, literally trying to forge a socialist civilization from the ground up, rejecting capitalism in, well, pretty much every conceivable way. We're going to explore how this ambitious and, let's be honest, often brutal vision played out on the ground in a very specific place, Magnitogorsk.
That's exactly right. Kotkin uses the story of Magnitogorsk, this absolutely colossal steel plant built basically from scratch in the Urals, as a kind of microcosm for the entire Soviet project. We'll trace the journey from those, grand industrial plans and the almost insurmountable challenges of construction through the everyday struggles and actually the surprising adaptations of the people who flocked there. It's a fascinating and sometimes quite chilling narrative that shows us the creation of a new social structure and the pervasive reality of state control, which, culminates in the Great Terror.
Really does.
Ultimately, this deep dive reveals the profound paradoxes of an ideology that aspired to create a perfect future, but often did so through immense sacrifice and, frankly, truly brutal methods.
Okay, let's start unpacking this.
Yeah.
The story, it really kicks off with the immense, almost boundless ambition of the Bolsheviks, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
They weren't just aiming for industrialization in the normal sense. They wanted to build this mighty state that would not only rival, but, spectacularly surpass the achievements of established powers like those in Europe and the United States.
Yeah.
Kotkin argues this was more than just an economic plan. It was a deeply ingrained urge, a sort of historical destiny almost.
Yeah, like it echoed Russia's long tradition of state-led social engineering, maybe even stretching back to figures like Peter the Great.
Right, and what's fascinating here is the sheer audacity of this goal. They genuinely intended to create something fundamentally new, something that would be seen as forward-looking and unequivocally progressive on the global stage.
And this vision gained immense ideological power, especially when you consider the backdrop of the 1930s, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Western capitalist countries were just reeling from the Great Depression, while across Europe, fascism was alarmingly on the rise.
A scary time.
Yeah, and the USSR deliberately positioned itself as an anti-fascist bulwark, a beacon of progress. For many, its rapid state-controlled development seemed like an almost implausible achievement in the march of universal history. It seemed to prove that socialism was the future.
And at the very beating heart of this grand ambition, this vision for an entirely new civilization, was Magnitogorsk, literally Magnetic Mountain City. It wasn't just a project. It was conceived as the ultimate symbol, the absolute epitome of the Bolshevik commitment to radical social transformation. This was like a Marshall style of economic mobilization, an almost feverish infatuation with heavy industry.
Totally. The goal was to build a steel plant that would be the absolute equal of the very best in the capitalist world.
And they had a specific model in mind, didn't they?
Indeed. The specific inspiration, as Kotkin details, was the U.S. steel plant in Gary, Indiana.
Oh, okay.
Grigory Ordzhonikidze, who was Stalin's powerful industrialization chief and a key Politburo member, actually ordered that a factory just like it be built in the Soviet Union.
Just like it. Wow.
Yeah. He believed that if capitalists could construct such an impressive plant, Soviet workers and peasants, embodying this idea of the new socialist man, certainly should too.
That really highlights the inherent tension, doesn't it? This desire to reject capitalism, yet an undeniable fascination with and even emulation of its industrial scale and achievements.
Absolutely, a real contradiction there.
But that grand vision, as clear and compelling as it might have sounded on paper, proved immensely harder to execute in the mud and grit of the Urals.
Oh, definitely.
The initial 5-year plan targets for pig iron were astonishingly quickly deemed too modest, which seems crazy given the scale.
Right. And this led to a state Kotkin vividly describes as profound disequilibrium, characterized by gigantism, immoderation, refusal of realism.
So how did this refusal of realism actually manifest on the ground? What did that look like?
Well, it basically cascaded into immense, often self-inflicted struggles.
Yeah.
The Soviets, despite their anti-capitalist ideology, desperately needed foreign technical assistance, and they secured it, most notably from the American firm Arthur McKee & Co. But this partnership was just plagued from the very start.
How so?
Deep suspicion on the Soviet side, fundamental misunderstandings, wildly impractical deadlines for technical drawings, for construction phases.
So a recipe for disaster.
Pretty much. And what's truly fascinating here is how Soviet engineers, often in a bid to prove their own capabilities and, crucially, their political allegiance, would often criticize and then alter the American designs.
Alter them.
Yes, with what Kotkin calls utter disregard for the often catastrophic consequences.
Oh, wow. So it wasn't just theoretical disagreements. These were changes that had real physical repercussions for the plant itself.
Exactly. And it wasn't just design issues either, was it? The actual materials and equipment were apparently a nightmare.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Well, materials purchased abroad didn't always meet the specified quality, and stuff sent from Soviet factories often arrived in disrepair, sometimes even like rusted or incomplete.
You can't build a state-of-the-art plant like that.
Exactly. Imagine trying. This led to serious operational failures that are almost hard to fathom. For instance, that first blast furnace at Magnitogorsk,
Yeah.
it suffered no fewer than 550 stoppages in its first year alone.
550.
In 1 year. Think about that.
Yeah.
Almost 2 stoppages a day. It was so fundamentally flawed, it had to be completely rebuilt after just 21 months.
Unbelievable.
And beyond the design flaws and material issues, the basic level of development, just the sheer infrastructure on the ground, was shockingly low. As late as 1936, 2/3 of earth-moving work was still done without mechanization.
Just people with shovels.
Picture thousands of them, and blueprints often had glaring mistakes or even missing sections, which, for a project of this scale, well, it would be unthinkable in more developed industrial nations.
It really speaks volumes about the incredible pressure and maybe the lack of practical expertise in certain levels.
Definitely, that pressure was immense.
That's a truly staggering amount of rework and inefficiency, particularly for such a critical, high-profile project, supposed to be an industrial showpiece.
Mhm.
Yet despite all these engineering and logistical nightmares, the regime ultimately had its own way of calculating success, right? They did eventually produce millions of tons of pig iron steel rolling stock.
True, though often considerably less than the initial plan targets. And the quality wasn't always what you'd call usable steel by international standards.
But the sheer fact that anything was produced was hailed as a triumph.
Exactly. And crucially, they achieved full employment at a time when much of the capitalist world was mired in joblessness. That was a huge propaganda point.
Right. But beyond the colossal steel plant itself, there was this other monumental task, simply peopling this massive construction site in the middle of nowhere.
And not just gathering people, but as the book emphasizes, this radical ambition to recreate them.
Ah, the social engineering aspect.
Precisely. This wasn't just migration. It was a social engineering project on a grand scale. Recruitment relied on special mobilizations of party members and skilled workers, often sent there as a matter of political duty. Then there was Orgnabor, which was a formal system of organized recruitment. Officials negotiated directly with collective farms for labor power, essentially drafting peasants into industrial work.
Wow, drafting them.
Yeah. And despite trains crammed with new arrivals coming regularly, Kotkin even points out that at the height of construction, there wasn't yet a proper train station, so people were literally just dropped off in the wilderness.
Dropped in the wilderness. Good grief.
Despite all that, the site faced a significant and persistent problem of labor fluidity.
Right.
Meaning excessive departures, people leaving almost as quickly as they arrived,
Yeah.
rather than an insufficient supply of new workers.
So high turnover.
Extremely high. And the goal wasn't just to get bodies there, it was to transform these new urbanites, many of them former peasants, into a new socialist man, imbued with this almost messianic sense of historical mission. Building a socialist world, a worker's paradise.
This sounds less like city planning in any conventional sense and more like a colossal living social experiment constantly in flux.
That's a great way to put it.
And we see this played out so clearly with things like the internal passport system, the Propiska, right?
Yeah.
Which effectively gave the state absolute legal power to control everyone's movement.
It really did. It's hard to imagine the daily anxiety of navigating that system where the slightest administrative misstep or, the whims of an official could trigger an investigation leading to eviction or even worse.
A truly pervasive form of control.
Mm-hmm. And the physical design of the city itself was fraught with these same conflicts between utopian ideals and, harsh realities.
Like the housing.
Exactly. German architect Ernst May, who was internationally acclaimed for his groundbreaking functionalist workers' housing in Frankfurt, was brought in to design this non-capitalist city.
Okay, so a big name.
A very big name. He envisioned compact, rational settlements with extensive public facilities and standardized, prefabricated housing, all designed to ensure egalitarian access to sunlight and air for all residents, reflecting that socialist ideal of equality.
Sounds good in theory. But his core idea of parallel development, building the city as quickly as the factory, that got sidelined almost immediately, didn't it?
Completely sidelined. Housing construction fell drastically behind. Get this. Only a shocking 10% of the 1932 plan was actually fulfilled.
10%.
10%. It's no wonder Moscow was described as shocked by this incomprehensible situation.
I'll bet they were.
The ideological imperative of heavy industry just utterly overshadowed the human need for decent living conditions. So while top officials, like Director Avrami Zaviniagin, a key figure there, ended up building large individual houses for themselves.
Of course they did.
Houses copied almost exactly from American architectural catalogs, no less.
You're kidding. The irony.
I know. Meanwhile, a quarter of the city's population lived in mud huts.
Well, that says.
Yeah, primitive but surprisingly sturdy structures that actually offered a degree of family privacy you wouldn't find in the overcrowded barracks.
So people adapted, even in those conditions.
They had to. Interestingly, authorities despised these mud huts, saw them as a symbol of backwardness, even though they provided essential relief for the housing crisis.
Which just illustrates that profound cultural gap Kotkin talks about, right?
Yep.
Between the educated elite, maybe embracing Western consumer goods, and the unwashed majority of the proletariat.
Absolutely. And to try and bridge this gap, you had red corners, designated spaces in barracks, and communal buildings become centers for cultural work,
What does that involve?
aiming to raise the culture nest or cultural level of the proletariat. Not necessarily about fostering a distinct proletarian culture, but more about instilling homage to revolutionary icons and ideas, basically Sovietizing daily life.
So daily life in Magnitogorsk really became a study in these profound paradoxes. On the one hand, a supposedly classless society, yet privilege was an integral part of life from the very beginning. You see it with special dining halls, better housing for shock workers and engineers.
Right.
And while privileges for the highest party officials were generally kept quiet, the conspicuous shopping and after-hours exploits of what Kotkin calls the Baresa Society, like an elite consumer club, were actually openly reported in the press.
It's wild, isn't it? Talk about a contradiction in a system promising equality. It's a stark illustration of how quickly hierarchies emerged, even within a system designed to eliminate them.
And the city itself suffered from this kind of inherent structural paradox, too. Kotkin describes it as a whole city of outskirts.
Yeah, isolated, far from main rail lines, unnavigable rivers, utterly erratic mail. This physical isolation contributed to the feeling of being on the frontier of a new world, but also of being totally cut off. And the thoroughgoing statization of property meant private property was eliminated, yet this led to a class of functionaries exercising de facto ownership over state-controlled property. It created a whole new kind of power dynamic.
So people had to develop ways to cope, to survive.
They absolutely did. Kotkin brilliantly terms them little tactics of the habitat.
Little tactics, like what?
Like maneuvering to obtain and then cling on to living space, which, once you got it, was incredibly difficult to be evicted from, even if you misused it.
So squatters' rights, almost.
Kind of, yeah. And then there was the infamous propiska system, those internal passports, giving the state absolute legal power to control everyone's movement where they lived, where they worked.
Total control.
Yet, paradoxically, even the housing administration itself, the KBU or Everyday Life Administration responsible for everything from housing to utilities, struggled constantly with chronic financial deficits and remarkably low, often unpaid rents.
So even the controllers couldn't make it efficient.
Exactly. It highlights the chaotic inefficiencies even within the apparatus of control itself.
It's clear the inefficiencies weren't just confined to construction or housing. On the labor front, the drive for productivity was absolutely relentless, wasn't it? Almost to the point of absurdity.
Oh, completely. Stakhanovism, named after the miner, who famously exceeded his norm by, what was it, an astonishing 474%.
Incredible number.
Right. That became the archetypal form of socialist labor, encouraging this inordinate individual exertion. But it was about far more than just output, wasn't it?
How so?
Workers were under constant pressure to demonstrate not just productivity, but also self-improvement, dedication to the cause. Their labor was explicitly tied to the international class struggle.
So your work on the factory floor was part of the global revolution.
That was the message, framing their efforts as a contribution to the global triumph of socialism over capitalism. This ideological intensity permeated every sphere, even the courts.
Yeah.
The courts themselves were explicitly expected to educate the citizens in the spirit of devotion to the motherland and the cause of socialism.
So justice wasn't just about law.
Not at all. It was another tool for pervasive ideological control, shaping minds and ensuring conformity through coercion.
And despite this relentless drive for productivity and the promise of full employment, the city suffered from perpetual and severe shortages of basic goods. That must have been incredibly difficult.
Immensely difficult. And this created another fascinating paradox. While the state strove for total control, informal distribution networks and private middlemen inevitably arose alongside the official, often failing, state supply system.
People found ways. The black market, basically.
Essentially, yes. People found ways to make do. There were even instances of state agencies themselves, desperate for resources, bartering construction materials for food, effectively forming de facto department stores outside the planned economy.
State agencies doing bartering. Wow.
Yeah, and to combat these economic crimes like embezzlement and speculation, they held demonstration trials.
Public trial.
Regularly held in public venues like industrial clubs, cinemas. These often resulted in death sentences, and their moral lessons were heavily reinforced by widespread media publicity. A chilling deterrent.
Absolutely chilling.
Even seemingly simple tasks like bread distribution were plagued by unforeseen complications, leading to stores taking gigantic quantities they couldn't possibly sell because of convoluted payment systems.
Just systemic failure.
It really underscores a core issue: the sheer lack of light industry. In 1939, Kotkin notes, only 240,000 rubles worth of consumer goods were produced for a city of over 50,000 people.
It's nothing.
Practically nothing. Think about that imbalance. An industrial powerhouse that couldn't even consistently provide basic necessities for its own population.
That economic struggle, the scarcity, the constant pressure, it all brings us to the profound and terrifying atmosphere of the 1930s, shaped so heavily by the Great Terror.
Yes.
Stalin presented this incredibly twisted argument, didn't he? That the USSR's unprecedented triumphs paradoxically led to increased insecurity, necessitating the unmasking of internal wreckers amid what he called capitalist encirclement.
Exactly. It's a completely warped logic.
What was the official line to justify this internal purge? How did they sell it?
The narrative was constantly reinforced by exaggerated or fabricated reports, rearmed Germany, aggressive Italian fascism, Japanese expansion in the Far East, painting this picture of overwhelming external threat that supposedly justified extreme internal vigilance.
Creating
Precisely. And the search for internal enemies was deceptively framed as a party revival and even democratization. They held unprecedented secret ballot elections, which led to a dramatic turnover of lower-level party officials.
So it looked democratic.
It created an illusion of popular participation while simultaneously making everyone incredibly vulnerable. Denunciations often motivated by personal grudges or fear, but sometimes by genuine belief in the cause, were made to appear altruistic. Informing was portrayed as being a loyal citizen helping the state.
This is where it gets really interesting and incredibly dark. These high-profile show trials, like the infamous Kemerovo mine case.
Oh, yes.
Involving a German engineer and accusations of a Trotskyite conspiracy with the Gestapo.
Yeah.
They were widely publicized precisely to teach these chilling lessons about subversion, weren't they?
Absolutely. They were theater, pure and simple. Theater designed to instill fear and conformity. The terror effectively functioned as a kind of socialist class war against anyone deemed an enemy, even against high-ranking bosses and managers.
Even powerful people weren't safe.
No one was safe. Seemingly powerful figures like director Zhevnyagin himself, once he was transferred to Moscow, became targets. And it's a truly striking and deeply tragic historical point that many counter-revolutionaries, despite facing torture and certain execution, they confessed. They confessed due to their abiding, almost unbreakable faith in the Communist Party and its ideals, believing their confessions somehow served the larger cause.
That's heartbreaking.
It is. Yet they were executed all the same. Kotkin gives the horrific example of Golubitsky, the chief of the blooming mill. He was nailed by false testimony from subordinates' testimony obtained through torture.
Just brutal.
The scale was immense. In Magnitogorsk alone, in 1937-38, 70 leading officials were executed, and another 57 sent to labor camps. This wasn't just about eliminating opposition, it was about ensuring absolute ideological purity through terror.
What a chilling detail about those confessions, though. It really speaks to the psychological grip of the ideology, doesn't it?
It really does.
This deep dive into Magnitogorsk truly shows us that Stalinism wasn't just a despotic political system or simply a collection of brutal policies. It was, like you said, a complex, often wildly contradictory and utterly totalizing effort to forge an entirely new society, to build a civilization, and even to engineer a new kind of human being. The constant ideological struggle, the absolute refusal to admit mistakes, and the pervasive control that reached into every single corner of life, it profoundly shaped every aspect of existence there.
And what's truly fascinating here, and maybe the most enduring insight from Kotkin's work, is how the very ideology of building this non-capitalist future, however flawed its implementation, however brutal its enforcement, it still provided a framework.
A framework for what?
For people to find a niche, a way to survive, adapt, and even develop a sense of pride in a society that genuinely seemed qualitatively different from the poverty and exploitation they associated with the capitalism they'd left behind or heard about.
So belief persisted even amidst the terror.
That belief, even amidst terror, is what makes Magnitogorsk such a compelling and often heartbreaking historical case study.
So what does this all mean? If we connect this to the bigger picture, it raises a really important question for you, the listener, to consider. In a society that simultaneously promised utopian dreams and delivered brutal realities, how did individuals navigate that complex and dangerous space between the official narrative and their own lived experience? And what can that tell us about the remarkable human capacity for resilience, for adaptation, and maybe even for unwavering belief in the face of such overwhelming and often terrifying forces?